on to our next section under finance, ordinance number 1899, utility rate increase, continued from May 5th, 2020. I think we have,
I can start it.
okay, our city administrator, Mr. Olborn, will start that off.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start this. Familiar to most of the council members, except for our new council member. This is the fourth time we've had this subject. Just a little wrap up. Of course, we went ahead and delayed the proposed 2020 rate increase, and we did some really number crunching and got a lot of good input from the city council. So we kind of have a little bit of update. This is familiar, but I guess the information changes over time. So we did go ahead and update for some of the new options here. We do have our interim finance director, Mike Bailey, here to assist with the presentation. We also have some finance staff, and the primary person giving this presentation is our familiar Sean Korn. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to go ahead and go through the presentation, Sean.
Thank you, Blaine. Afternoon, Mayor and council members. I'll share my screen here. So this is very similar to what you all have seen prior in our earlier discussions. There are a few changes, as the city manager mentioned, and I will walk through those. I will move through some of the prior slides that you've seen fairly quickly, but just wanted to remind you of some of the key assumptions and input into the analysis. So I'll start over with the overview, key drivers, and then we'll look at any of the changes. I think the key takeaway here from this slide is really providing a long-term sustainable rate revenues for each of these utilities. As enterprise funds, we want to make sure that there is sufficient funding for those operating and capital needs, while we take into consideration the city's financial policies and metrics as we review debt service coverage requirements and overall ending target reserve funds and other needs. As we've talked about in the past, we've had a couple changes as part of this. We've had changes on the solid waste side with the county's tipping fees and recycling rates. You just heard from Mr. Bridges on the change on the water side. We have built that project into this since we've spoken last as part of this. Just as a reminder, we started with the 2019 and 2020 budgets for O&M expenses. We have our revised or current capital plan. This is the one that you all have seen where staff has moved projects, shifted projects to meet the overall goals as we've been working with the council through this process. It does exclude the interpretive center, as we discussed a couple meetings ago as part of that. One point I wanted to mention to make sure that everybody was on the same page. Over this time period, as we start looking at the projected rates and the reserve funds, is we are utilizing reserves in all utilities in 2021 through 2024. It's not the same for all of them, and I'll have a little more detail on that. We did add the Campbell Lake transmission pipe relocate in 2022 for the water utility. And then we're also looking at we provided one additional alternative for wastewater for your consideration. Everything else is all the same for storm drain. On solid waste, the primary change is we've smoothed those rate adjustments. So based on our prior discussion during the last meeting, we've made some minor adjustments there. Just a reminder on the financial metrics, debt service coverage ratios, there's really two components that we're looking at. The first is a one-time coverage on all debt. So total revenues less O&M equals at least 1 times the total annual debt service payment. That's the one that we're concerned about as I've been talking with you. On the revenue bonds, or bond in your case, there's a single revenue bond. That is a 1.25 times coverage minimum. We're strong on the revenue bond. It's the all-in debt service coverage that I've been concerned about as we've been walking through this. Also a reminder on the reserve fund balances, we reduced the minimum target for stormwater and solid waste to 20%. We've maintained the 25% for wastewater and water, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So we've been looking at various alternatives as we've been going through this process. What we have here today is what I've worked with staff to put together based on, and I put this in quote, input and direction. It's the comments that you all have made from council, giving us feedback and input on the analysis. The only changes are the additional wastewater alternative. We've talked about this in the past. We put a scenario together where we use $400,000 of general fund reserves in 2021. And then on the water side, it's the Campbell Lake main relocation. When we start looking at rates or rate impacts, we're proposing and recommending to maintain the current structure or how you charge your customers. And we've simply adjusted the rate levels based on the overall percentage adjustment. So at this point, we're requesting that the council provides us any final direction as we move forward for the adoption process in October at the council meetings, and then ultimate implementation the beginning of January 2021. So here's some key points. I tried to expand on a few of these so that everybody has an understanding of some of the information and the analysis that is going on in the rate model itself for each of the 4 utilities. So for water, we're proposing and recommending minimal rate adjustments. We're looking at no change in 2021 or 2022, so 0% change, and 3% annually thereafter. That was impacted by the Campbell Lake main relocation, making sure we meet our target minimum reserve levels over the time frame. We are using approximately $875,000 of available reserves in 2021 through 2024. So we're buying that down, and you'll see that when I get to the reserve chart, how we're using those funds. On the storm drain side, again, fairly minimal adjustments to the overall storm drain rates. That's really driven by the shifting of capital improvement needs. And we're using approximately $280,000 of available reserves in 2022 through 2024. So again, for storm drain, no change in rates for 2021, and then 2.5% annually over that projected time period that we were reviewing. We are meeting our minimum targets for reserves, and we're making sure that we meet those. We're a little bit higher out there, but we also have shifted some capital out farther outside of 2024. And we know as the city's going through the planning process, the master planning process for the storm drain utility, there may be additional capital needs or permitting requirements identified through that process. On the solid waste side, we are recommending revenue adjustments. Currently, rates or revenues are not sufficiently or are not covering at all the overall operating costs. That's really driven by the increase from Island County and their disposal costs, the tipping fee and the recycling rates as part of that. And as we look forward from 2021 through 2022, we are using approximately $570,000 of available reserve funds to minimize those rate adjustments. As I mentioned, as I started this off, in the prior presentations, we provided the council with some various solid waste alternatives. Some had a higher increase in 2021 and then lower in the out years, and then a lower in 2021 and higher. We smoothed those for this scenario. So 9.5% annually in 2021, 2022, and 2023, and then 4% in 2024. So that's our long range look there. As part of this time period, we are not meeting our minimum reserve targets. We're below those, but I call it the happy face slide. We drift down, and then we come back up to our target in 2024. And really in the short term, what's happening is we're utilizing reserves to fund that increase in disposal costs that has been implemented by Island County. On the wastewater side, we've been talking about the necessary rate adjustments to meet the overall operating and capital needs. And so the original plan that we've been working with was a 14.5% in 2021, a 7% in 2022, and 2% thereafter. The alternative that we put together, which would utilize $400,000 of general fund reserves in 2021, would reduce that to 10.5%. We would need to increase 2022 from 7 to 7.5, comparing the base to the alternative, and then increase 2023 from 2 to 6%. That would get us essentially to the overall revenue needs by that time frame. The key driver here, as we've discussed, is maintaining that all-in debt service coverage of 1.0. So when we take total revenues less O&M expenses, that is at least equal to our annual debt service. So theoretically, that's breaking even. That does exclude the capital component of that, though, any ongoing annual needs that are included in that. Now, just as a point of reference, when we talked about this a little bit in the past, general fund or other reserve transfers or other sources of revenue don't generally impact the coverage ratio. So that adding a piece of revenue like the general fund transfer or getting funds from somewhere else, those are generally not allowed in the calculation of the debt service coverage ratio. We are also not meeting our overall minimum targets. We're using about 1.1 million in the base case and 1.4 million in the alternative in 2021 through 2022. Now, this is not different or very different from what the plan was early on. I'll go way back to 2011, 12, 15, 16. We always had a pinch point about this time in the sewer wastewater rate study. And so this is when we knew we'd be using reserves. That's why the council in the past had ramped up the rates, and this was one of the reasons for that. So the overall adjustment is still there. We need to get to that point as part of that. And that transfer of general fund reserves has an impact on rates, but it's fairly minimal, and I can show you that a little bit. I will show you that a little bit later. Here are the overall annual rate adjustments. You can see there are no adjustments in 2020. That's the year we're sitting in right now. In 2021, so if approved by the council, starting in January 1, then the only rate adjustments would be for solid waste and wastewater. So the green bar is the solid waste. That's the first bar in 2021 on the left. And that's that 9.5% for 3 years, and then we drop down to 4%. The red bar is the base case wastewater. So you can see that's our 14.5, and then we drop down to our 7, and then we go at about 2% a year. The orange bar is the alternative with the general fund transfer. So we have our 10.5, and then we have our 7.5, and then our 6, and then we run back down. In 2022, we pick up the storm drain adjustment of 2.5%, and then that carries on through the 4 years. And in 2023, we pick up the water at 3% in 23 and 24. And so you can see how that would be phased in over the years. On the reserve side, this is a chart you've seen before. There's some minor changes to this on the water and solid waste side. Water still hits above our minimum target in 2024, and we're good in the out years. You can see the use of that $875,000 of reserves is incorporated in this, as well as funding ongoing capital improvements. Storm drain is strong, but again, in the out years, we have several large projects on the storm drain side that will be funded with those available reserves. Solid waste, we drop down as we use reserves to smooth in that overall rate adjustment to customer bills. And then we're short in 22 and 23, but we get back up to target levels in 2024. And then in wastewater, same story as we've seen in the past. We're running slightly below that target out into 2024. In a couple of years, we do make up and get to that minimum target based on our rate transition plan that we have. So based on those overall adjustments, then here is the combined utility bill. So water, storm drain, solid waste, and wastewater. 2020, that's essentially the current rates. That's the rates as they sit today. 2021, we pick up the change in wastewater and solid waste. Storm drain and water, there's no change. 2022, we pick up the solid waste, wastewater, and storm drain component. And then in 23 and 24, there are increases to all 4 utilities based on that rate transition plan. What that looks like on an annual basis, again, is on the combined bill. So what is the total change in the city customers' bills for all 4 utilities? It would be a 9.1% in 21, 5.3% in 22, and then 3.1 in 23, and 2.5% in 24. Just as a note, this is based on the base case wastewater. If the council were to select the alternative where we use $400,000 of general fund reserves, then that would reduce the impact in 21 and 22 slightly, but it increases the impact in 23 and 24. So it kind of pushes down on the front end and pulls that up on the back end to get to the same point. Now, as we've been going through this, I wanted just to give you a comparison based on the input and feedback that the council has provided. The chart here looks at those different structures that we looked at. The red bar, or the bar on the right-hand side, is what I just described as the combined bill change. The blue bar, or the left bar, is the original base case that we brought to the council earlier this year. So that was that original where we were looking at about 6.5% combined utility for the first 3 years, and then dropping down to 2 to 3%. The recommendation here this afternoon, and based on the analyses that we've developed so far, you would see that slightly higher increase in 21, and then fairly comparable as we go out into the out years through 2024 as part of this. Part of that driver in 2021 is the deferral of any adjustment in 2020. Really driving a good portion of that is the wastewater, and then some of the other portion would be the solid waste. So as we go through this, rate adjustments are necessary, and that should say 2021 through 2024, not 2020, sorry. Really to meet our overall operating and capital needs, target debt service coverage ratios for wastewater, and reserve targets for each of the utilities. Again, we can use transfers of reserves. Wastewater is the example we looked at today, but that doesn't change the overall revenue or rate needs for the long term, but it does impact rates in the short term, and it does not impact our debt service coverage ratio. Water rates can be deferred based on what we know today through 2023, storm drain through 2022, and then solid waste and wastewater do need to have their rates adjusted to make sure that we're adequately funding the operating and capital needs as we move forward. So next steps are to take input and feedback from the council to move forward into the October council meetings, to move that forward to request approval and implementation of the final rates. And so with that, I'll take any questions or comments or discussion. I do have, in this slideshow, I do have the actual rates for the next several years that can be looked at as part of this, and also bill comparisons, very similar to what you've seen before, comparing to other local agencies if the council would like to refresh their memory on those components. Last point, sorry. We're looking at adopting rates for a 2-year period, 2021 through 2022, which would align with the budget cycle so that this information can then be built into the budgets and taken forward. And with that, I will turn it back over to the mayor and council.
Thank you, Sean. I see we've got a question from Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Sean, geez, I just went out the window. Could you show us to refresh our memory, what the rates may look like, please? You said you had 2 other slides you could show. I think it would be helpful, especially for our new council member, but refresh all our memories, please.
Absolutely. So on the water side, this is the fixed base charge. And so it's based on a meter size, varies by meter size. The larger the meter, the larger the charge for residential, commercial, churches, schools, etc. For multifamily, that is a per unit charge. And so that's calculated based on the number of living units in that multifamily complex. On the consumption charge for water, it is a tiered structure for each of the different customer classes. For single family and multifamily, the tier changes by number of living units. So if you have 2 living units, a duplex, then that would get twice the amount in each tier. But it's 0 to 3 CCF. A CCF is 748 gallons. And so you can see how that rate increases as we get above 7 CCF through that. For commercial or other non-residential, the tiers are a little larger, and these were based originally around the consumption patterns of each of these customer classes, as well as irrigation 0 to 10. Comparison-wise, as you look at this, we looked at a handful of different utilities here in the area. On the bottom, the dark line and the hashed line are the present and proposed rates. Again, no change in 2021, so there's no adjustment to those lines. And you can see how you compare here to the various other utilities. And I would, guess right about at that median on the water side. We've got some that are higher, Langley, LaConner, Skagit PUDs up there, along with all the customers of Skagit PUD. And then we've got some other folks that are a little bit lower, Marysville, Everett, and others like that. On the storm drain side, it's a flat rate per equivalent unit, equivalent ERU. So for single family, it's $14.22 a month, or sorry, for everybody, it's $14.22 per equivalent unit. And you can see how that adjusts. And then looking at where others are in the area, very similar utilities here, again, pretty in line with many of the other local utilities, right around that $10 to $15 range. And I will say these are fees that are being looked at by a lot of different folks, and that applies to all 4 utilities where they may have ongoing rate studies currently as part of that, or they do annual rate studies. On the solid waste side, it varies depending for residential based on the size of your cart, 20 gallon, 35 gallon, 65 or 95 gallon. And then for non-residential based on the size of it in yards, so the bigger containers or carts, and then the number of pickups. So as we looked at these, you can see again, right about in the middle here for the solid waste side. Some of these they included yard waste separately, or they have it included in their rate, or don't offer that as part of it. And then finally, wastewater rates, the monthly fixed charge for residential, a per unit for multifamily. And then on the commercial side, there's a base charge and a volume charge. And the same with the schools, there's a base charge and a volume charge. And so that was the baseline scenario. So if you want to compare here, I'm going to look at it the last year to start with in 2024, $130.98. The alternative, where we use $400,000 in general fund dollars, and then up the outer years, we end up $1 higher. And if you look in 21 and 22, 113 and 122 versus 117 and $1.25. So there's some savings early on by using those funds, but we do end up a little bit higher as we lose that compounding of rates to get up to that same level that is necessary. On the comparison, as we've talked about in the past, we are on the far right side of this comparison as part of that, and we've talked through those different situations based on the cost of and the value of that new plant to the city of Oak Harbor. And then Blaine is the most comparable, given they have a similar situation a couple of years ago. But again, many of these utilities are looking at the same issues that you have just dealt with your current plant. As the EPA, federal and state requirements become more stricter on nutrient removal, discharges into Puget Sound and the related areas, many of these utilities are looking at similar impacts that they may have to deal with in the next several years. And that was my last slide.
questions for Sean? A lot of work there, I know. Thank you, Sean, staff. We've got some time too. If council has questions, please communicate with us about these, and then we'll move forward in October.